Right, yeah. So you now know that this meeting is being recorded. This is so our colleagues can watch it afterwards if they miss this, which people do. Neil's from Thurrock Lifestyle Solutions, who are very much in the mould of an organisation, working led by people with disabilities. So it's with great pleasure I hand over to Neil to lead things off today, and I'll sit back and enjoy it. So welcome, Alex, and thank you, Neil.
Hi everybody. Hi Alex. It's really good to meet you. So really, just to kick us off, because I'm sure most people on here know about shared lives, etc. But it would be really good if you could just chat a little bit about what that's all about, really.
Sure, and obviously Rachel knows Shared Lives very well as one of the Shared Lives providers and one of the leading ones as well. So our work at Shared Lives Plus is all about helping people to find supportive households and to support each other. So Shared Lives is used by about 15,000 people across the UK, and we're a membership organisation for all the people and the organisations who are involved in doing that. And there are about 10,000 shared life carers now who've all been matched with an adult who needs support, who either comes to live with them and lives as part of their family, or they visit their chosen shared life carer for day support or short breaks. So to give you an example of what that's like, my colleague Meg, who's one of our experts by experience, spent years in psychiatric wards and in the mental health system. And when she was medically well enough to leave the NHS and return to the community, she didn't have a community to return to as a young adult. So she was matched with Hayley, shared life carer in Rachel's neck of the woods, and so together they that was Meg's route back into not just sort of learning independent living skills, but also, as she puts it, making friends, going on adventures, and returning to, or actually for the first time, really setting out in living independently as a young adult. So Shared Lives is all about that combination of support. So it's CQC regulated personal care service for which people are trained and paid, and there's quite a lot of infrastructure and backup behind it. But it's also deeply personal. It's about people being matched together, deciding on both sides that they've got a good match, that it's not just that somebody can support someone, but actually that they click and that they're going to fit with each other's lives. And then having that, not that service really, but just that ordinary family or community life, whatever that looks like to them. And that's true of home share as well, which is another model based on matching people together. So if usually in home share, it's an older person who just needs some low-level support or companionship matched with a younger person who's looking for somewhere to live. And the younger person moves in with the older person and helps out rather than paying rent. So again, it's a mixture of support with some structure behind it, provided by 23 home share organisations across the UK. But ultimately, it's a personal arrangement between those individuals deciding to share their housing, share some bills, but really to be each other's companions and friends. And our most recent initiative is something called Family by Family, which comes from Australia, in which a family who has been through trouble or difficulty and come out the other side is matched with a family which is currently going through similar trouble or difficulty, and with the help of coaches, the sharing family, as they're called, provide a kind of whole family mentoring, befriending, role modeling support to the seeking family, and then some of the seeking families then go on to become sharing families themselves. So there are all ways in which people can come together. You put enough structure in to make sure it's safe, but not so much that you kill the things that make it valuable, and that help people to live good lives. Ultimately, that's what it's all about.
Fantastic. So it's interesting for me because I love shared lives. I happen to live in Southend and I see it work really effectively here. But it was seen in the early days as being you were quite a disruptive, seen as quite radical, yet it makes such common sense. So did when you first were thinking about this, and as you go into different areas, do you see yourselves as big radicals, or does it just seem obvious to you?
I would say shared lives is a radical idea from 14th century Belgium, which is where it started in a town called Giel that had a shrine to Saint Dymphna, the patron saint of mental illness. And pilgrims came from all over medieval Europe to Giel. And rather than building an asylum outside the city walls, they welcomed people into their homes. And that still exists today in Giel, that kind of boarding out sort of approach. It's slightly different to shared lives, but it's very much sort of where you could trace the roots back. And it's an idea that's sort of surfaced and then fizzled out again over the centuries. So in modern times, it's been going since the 70s. It had a very low profile. It grew, like lots of things, very organically. It was very unfashionable, I think, for a while. I've been involved for about 11 years now, which still makes me a newcomer in shared lives terms. You know, I meet shared life carers who've been doing this since, you know, for 40 years, and some families where it's now the son or daughter of the original shared life carer who is now providing shared lives, and the odd grandson or granddaughter doing the same as well. So it's radical and disruptive if you look at the world through the lens of traditional services. And that's why in the book, which I sort of wrote about my kind of culture shock on discovering this model and then sort of getting to know it, having worked in more traditional care forms, that's why I called it Escaping the Invisible Asylum, because I think we like to tell ourselves that we've dismantled the institutions, the workhouses, and the asylums, but actually I think we're constantly rebuilding and maintaining that kind of thinking in all of the ways in which we force people that need support to jump through all of our assessments. You know, we haven't got as many physical gates, but we've got plenty of gatekeepers, we've got plenty of thresholds, we've got plenty of ways in which you can cross from the community into service land. And so it should be disruptive. It needs to be.
Yeah, fantastic. I know, I'm sure you've read it, the Winterborn 10 Years On. Have you read the report that the families have written? What a depressing and sad read in many ways. There's lots of positive stories that eventually happened, but even recently we were asked to go and inspect an institution that was failing under CQC, and just totally shocked still some of the behaviours. There was a guy there who had massive challenging behaviour, and when we were talking to him, it's because he liked to eat his lunch at 12:30, but he wasn't allowed to have dinner till 1:15. Excuse me, you know, and this, I'm sure there's hundreds of examples like that. But so that, where did you think that institutional desire to push people down these routes come from? Is it because these, you know, big nasty national corporate providers are money driven? I mean, what's going on?
Yeah, so I think we often like to blame the system, and one of the things I'm skeptical about is whether there really is a system or not, or whether there's just us and the decisions we make every day. So I know lots of people that work in mental health, and one of the things I'm always struck by is that they're all really good people who are really kind of human and humane and think very much about the person. And nearly all of them say, one of my goals is to keep people out of the mental health system. And it strikes me that we can have these sort of service sectors which are full of really good people, really well motivated, and yet we think that what we create collectively is not good for people. So I think that some of that comes down to just the, you know, Vanier's who died recently, who founded L'Arche, said that all community begins in mystery and ends in bureaucracy. And I think there's that tendency where as soon as we start to associate and to become collective, it's very easy to, you know, to dehumanize ourselves over time, and we don't notice, you know, it is invisible. It's something that sort of seeps into the ways we live and the ways we work without us noticing it. So I don't think it's as simple as the kind of you know, left versus right, or I'm not even sure it's all about sector. I think it's a lot about scale. So I think the things that tend to be good and appealing and that feel human to us often happen at a very small scale, whether that's a small community initiative or the support that an individual or a small team does. And we often, if they're doing that within the context of a big service, we'll often say, you know, they'll get an award and they'll be celebrated for what they're doing, but they're seen as the exception. You know, why couldn't everybody be like this? Mm-hmm. And I think we get lost in that I often sort of think of it as this paradox of scale. The good stuff happens at a small scale, but our services are often organised at a big scale, and we've got these huge challenges and huge budgets and huge staff teams. And I think one of the ways in which we could find our way through this is to think about how, not just how we scale up things like shared lives, which is often how we're always asked, how are you going to scale this up? I think it's just as important to think about how we scale things down. And we've got some organizations and some models that are desperately in need of scaling down to human size, I think.
Yeah, and is that kind of where that we link into the think local, act personal agenda then?
Yeah, so think local, act personal, which is often known as TLAP, slightly unwieldy name, came out of the Putting People First initiative. There was a change of government, and I guess they decided they couldn't call the sequel Putting People Second, so they had to come up with a new name. I've been telling that joke for 10 years now. I really need to give it up. But Think Local Act Personal was bringing together people that were interested in personalisation in its wider sense. So as Craig said, the part that I've been most involved in is actually the communities and community capacity end of that, and recognition that individual choice and control, self-directed support are one crucial element of doing things differently. But actually, if that's all we do, we tend to end up with people as being seen as consumers, as isolated consumers, often with actually not very much state money to play with. And for many people whose support needs are social, that doesn't necessarily lead to a good life. So I think Local Act Personal for me is about that combination of the individual choice, control, independence, but also community and people's recognizing that for all of us, a good life is about how we are able to form connections and relationships with each other, and needing to work on both of those things. And I think there's a very strong focus on co-production within TLAP. So the National Co-Production Advisory Group, it's a group of citizens that helps select the chair that sits on the board alongside the representatives of national government, local government, provider bodies like us, and sector leaders. And that different, more equal conversation has been a really key part of what's made TLAP worthwhile, I think, over 10 years. And its key product is something called Making It Real, which is for organizations and for local areas. It's a kind of self-assessment from the perspective of people themselves, a set of commitments to are we making personalization real? Does this feel real? And it's well worth, it's very user-friendly and well worth looking up.
Yeah, I think for us, we talk about EVP, equal value partnership, rather than the professional gift model. It's about empowering people, if that's the right expression, but certainly getting alongside and being part of a team, etc. I mean, as it happens, one of my bosses has Down syndrome, and often when we're out and about, people assume I'm looking after him, and we kind of play on it a bit. It can be quite funny, but it's that classic thing, isn't it? People walk into a room and assume the man's in charge type thing, but times 100, which is fascinating. But there's a big thread that's running throughout all the things that you've done, Alex. It's about seeing people as experts by experience, because you used that expression just now, didn't you? And I think that's really important. That's key, isn't it? I guess, to seeing the individual through this and putting them at the centre.
Yeah, a really key sort of formative moment for me, sort of coming back to your question about Winterborn. A couple of years after I think I'm trying to remember the name of because there's been so many improvement programs that have sort of happened since Winterborn. The people with learning disabilities from the organisation Change in Leeds, who use that co-worker model of disabled and non-disabled person job sharing effectively, which has been really impactful. They ran a conference for people with learning disabilities, which was led by people. Norman Land hadn't been able to be at it. As the care minister, he'd had quite a significant illness, so he had a really good reason. But we organised a summit with Norman and Simon Stevens from the NHS and Andrea Sutcliffe, who was Chief Inspector at CQC, and a number of other leaders. And we asked people with learning disabilities what they wanted to focus on. And all the discussions in that improvement programme had been around things like quality and risk and safety and so on. And they said, all we want to talk about is people with learning disabilities being employed in health and care services. So we said, okay, fair enough. And this was a complete shock to lots of people in the room, because not only was that not sort of top of people's what do we do about Winterborn and the institution's agenda, it just hadn't figured at all. It wasn't part of that conversation in any way. And it really blindsided people in that room. But the reason that the people who were themselves co-workers and had experience of being treated as a colleague rather than as a patient or a service user or a beneficiary, they'd seen the kind of the way that was changing and getting to the root causes of some of those power problems that at the root of some of the issues we're talking about. And it made a real impact. Simon started a programme soon after that in which people with learning disabilities were employed in NHS England. It changed that kind of conversation in a way that by that point there must have been hundreds, probably thousands of hours of meetings and work done by people who didn't have a learning disability about what they were going to do at Winterborn. And the other thing that struck me about that was that it required thinking in terms of a different pace, allowing people to come to their own conclusions. And one of the reasons that people with learning disabilities have been excluded from the work up till then is because it was also urgent. We need to do everything at pace, at scale. We need to work really rapidly. We haven't got time to do this difficult co-production stuff. We'll come to that later. And of course, 2-3 years later, whatever it was, nothing had happened. All of the results were that exactly the same number of people were in institutions as had been before. The latest scandal was either happening or was on its way, because Winterborn was just one of a whole succession of those. So there was something about sort of, for me, that just really summed up the value and the reason for working in that different way, and also that it should feel uncomfortable, and that's kind of the point.
Yeah, absolutely. So in terms of the kind of financial world that we're all living in at the moment, what do you see the implications are for that in terms of the models that you're pushing then? Because traditionally, I see them as models that are also far more financially efficient, but it's really hard to unlock the money out of the system to be able to support them sometimes, isn't it?
Yeah, so I mean, shared lives, so we do a lot of work now with councils, and one of the things we do is we do cost comparisons between shared lives and other models of regulated care, and it consistently comes out at about £30,000 a year lower cost than comparable models for people with learning disabilities in particular. And that's not a notional cost. That's not about trying to sort of associate the better outcomes with savings. It's just lower cost. And yeah, that's still not always enough to persuade people to invest and to change what they're doing locally. So I think one of the real issues we have around public services in general, but with social care in particular at the moment, is that it is seen as this rolling financial crisis. And every time you think it couldn't get any worse, it gets a bit worse. And certainly the solution is put off a bit longer. And I think one of the difficulties in doing anything differently about that is that I think government has got very used, and particularly the Treasury's got very used to this idea that there is this crisis that everybody tells them is going to result in cataclysm any minute now, which requires billions of pounds to fix, which is generally also beset by all kinds of other problems, because we only tend to hear about it when something goes wrong, and it's full of models that people don't like very much. And what do you do about that? So I don't think that this kind of current financial crisis is going to be very different from all of the preceding financial crises that we've already been living through. I think that there is perhaps more of an opportunity, probably more from the pandemic and the shock of that than the financial crisis, to do things differently. And there is some of that appetite. There's also never been less capacity in councils to do things differently in many ways, because commissioning teams are so depleted. Not that they were particularly radical and doing things differently when they weren't depleted, but there is that issue. I think I'm interested in the Social Care Future partnership, which is trying to sort of turn some of that on its head. It's using a kind of really grassroots-led approach. So again, to people who will be familiar with that, where people who use services, and community organisations are a really key part of leading the agenda there. And what they're trying to do is to say, actually, there is this crisis, but if all we do is talk about the crisis, we will just sort of bake in to the politics and to the public perception the fact that nothing can be done about this awful thing. What we need is something much more optimistic, and they've come up with a vision for a different kind of social care future, which is much more about, don't we all want to live in a good place with people we love, doing things that are meaningful to us at every point in our lives. And the trick then is trying to translate that into, yes, but what does that look like, and how can we get there? So that I think, I'm sure you do, probably everybody here, that the route to actually doing that has to be much more about that combination of empowering individuals and empowering communities to with the proper resources to develop their own solutions. I don't think that this government's really in that space. Yeah. And I'm not hugely optimistic about where this government getting to a different place when it runs into the same problem that all the other governments have run into, which is that Department of Health and Social Care starts to get it, Treasury kind of doesn't and isn't that interested, and we don't have a government that's really shown itself to be up for radical, difficult things, I don't think. So yeah, mixed views on that.
I think the pandemic helped us in some ways, certainly where we're from. There was a lot of hyper-local that went on that was already there under the surface, and it came to the surface and came up with what we called community solutions. Mm-hmm. And for us, it's all about people requiring people and purpose in their lives. And we talk about community as an experience, not a location. And if you think of it like that, then some of these solutions are already there. And in terms of the finances, someone said something very interesting to me the other day. It's not that we're asking for a bigger cake because we know the cake's shrunk. We just want a bigger slice as the voluntary and community sector. And I thought that's an interesting way of putting it.
Yeah, and I think something about the relationship between state and the voluntary sector as well. I chaired what's clunkily called the joint VCSE review 2 or 3 years ago, which was a government working with the charity not-for-profit sector to look at what should happen to the relationship between government, both locally and nationally, and charities around the health and care sector. And we helped to, what they really wanted us to do was to help redesign what's now the Health and Wellbeing Alliance and the grant funding that goes alongside it, which is a national program. But what we were really interested in is looking at the relationship locally, because most charities get nowhere near government funding, and it's actually about their relationship with their councils and their local health organisations. And the shift we argued for there was not give the voluntary sector more money. It was co-commission, co-design your health and care system with the voluntary sector. And the reason you need to do that is because it's the only way you're going to start to address inequalities, because good organisations, good community organisations are probably your only route to having a conversation with the people you're currently ignoring. And the benefit of that would be services and systems which were designed with more people in mind and which felt more human. And if we did that, I think there would then be a much clearer case for why you resource those voluntary organisations that provide services, because they tend to do the sorts of things that people are asking for if they do what they say on the tin. There's also a challenge for charities in there, because I don't think all charities do that. And I wrote a paper a couple of months ago for RSA and NCVO called Meeting as Equals, which was looking at how charities have used asset-based or strengths-based approaches during the pandemic. And I was arguing in that we have a lazy tendency in this sector, I think, to say, look, we are asset-based, we do strengths-based working, asset-based working, we're community organisations, it's in our DNA. But we can all think of organisations that are actually quite unmoored from their communities, which enact some of the sorts of power structures and inequalities that they're set up to tackle, which certainly aren't all demonstrating the kinds of social change that we call for. And then I found some great organisations which are doing what you described, really, and doing things very differently. So one of them is an organisation called Slunglow Arts in Leeds, which has a really interesting history of being a kind of community theatre company that shares its premises with the country's oldest working man's club in Holbeck, which is very working class traditional area of South Leeds. And when the pandemic hit, they just put an envelope letter through the nearest 200 doors and said, look, we're here, we've got a van, we've got some people, what is it you actually need? And out of that, they became a food bank for about 5,000 people and a whole range of social support services. They completely reinvented themselves. And Alan Lane, who's one of the co-founders who I interviewed for it, said, I hate running a food bank. It's not, it's not fun, and it's not what I wanted to do. But there's no point in us putting on community theatre at a point when nobody can come and see it, or people are hungry. Yeah. And it's that willingness to be genuinely owned by community that I found really inspiring.
Yeah, no, that sounds amazing. Chip in, folks, with some questions. Brendan, you had one that was relevant.
Yeah, thanks, Alex. It's really a pleasure listening to you. The music to my ears, some of this. I worked as a commissioner in the public sector and then ran a commissioned service. There were lots of disagreements, but the one thing we agreed upon was this was the most inefficient and cumbersome way of getting money from the centre to communities that any of us could design. But that's 20 years ago. And 20 years on, this system still exists by and large. I keep hearing reports of its demise. I think they're premature. I think there's lots of vested interest in maintaining the current situation and the current systems. And grassroots, community-led initiatives, I hear about them all the time and totally inspired by them. But I don't see them achieving scale because the system is stacked against them. Am I unduly optimistic, or is there grounds for optimism somewhere, Alex? Tell me, please.
So yeah, on the one hand, we've got sort of quite a right-wing government, pretty keen on the value, the role of the private sector and on commissioning models, so I think there's the idea that we would be sort of moving towards a radical shift away from that, particularly in social care, where so much of the provision is in the private sector. I'm not hugely anticipating a radical change there. There are ways of doing this differently, as we know, and the things which have excited me sort of over the past years have been, I think the starting point is often direct payments, personal budgets, people getting individual control of their money. But I think the problem in the past has been that's also been the end point. And then you get to that kind of consumer type relationship. I think the things that have felt really promising for me is where people with their own individual control of resources have been helped to associate with each other and to form groups. Sometimes attempts to do that have been overly complicated. I think you can do that in really nuts and bolts sort of ways. But I think the different future I could imagine is one in which people do expect to have that individual control over resources. But they're doing that within a much more brokered and supported kind of local marketplace, in which people are helped to find others with similar needs or goals, and in which there's a really thriving micro enterprise sector as well. So there are some areas which have worked with organisations like Community Catalysts to develop tiny enterprises. So for instance, in Somerset, one of their Community Catalysts coordinators helped develop sort of 200 plus tiny home care agencies, people providing home care to a handful of people in their village or their street, and providing enough infrastructure for people to do that safely and legally, and to create some scale there, to create some larger numbers. Because coming back to this issue of scale, the problem with those sort of, with suggesting those sort of solutions to people who are looking at this vast commissioning procurement budget, is it just seems like small fry. But I think that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I think as long as we look at things that are currently small and think, well, they can't be, they're lovely, but they're not going to really make a difference, then that will be true. But actually, if you look at the way the world's changed, as we moved from an industrial age to a kind of an internet age, we're all doing things within these kind of frameworks, whether that's social media or Zoom, we're being brought together in all kinds of ways which still allow us to form very individual and flexible associations to have a lot of control over that. And I think that's the the future I think we're kind of groping towards in public services. And it's really hard to do. And I think it has to start with a different goal being set, particularly for our public services and particularly our health and care services. So in the book, I suggested that we need to move away, that we'll never have integration, we'll never have any of this kind of change until we've got a single goal for health and care services based around well-being and resilience. And for me, resilience is kind of your ability to maintain your well-being. It's all about that kind of well-being. And if we had that shared goal baked into public services and then running through commissioning and procurement, I think we could find a different approach. And we produced a model called the asset-based area, which is a kind of 10-point action plan for areas to be asset-based in everything they do, drawing quite heavily on the Wigan deal, which some of you will be familiar with, where they said, we're going to start with a different story. What are we here to do? And what kind of relationship do we want to have with people? But we're not going to stop there. We're also going to run that through how we work with the voluntary sector, how we what we measure, what good looks like, how we work with local enterprise and so on. And I've just been interviewing a number of councils around how you, again, what's that been like during the pandemic? And there are some grounds for optimism there. I mean, if you look at York, they're using the asset-based area as a way of, and have been for several years, as a way of reimagining what they want their relationship public services to be. I was talking to it's Hammersmith and Fulham. Yes, I always get Hammersmith and Fulham Tower Hamlets mixed up. I'm from the north. It's Hammersmith and Fulham, I think, who had baked in co-production with disabled people into every level of decision making, and not just about their services, but about things like the redevelopment of their civic area in the centre of the borough. And we're starting to do things differently because of that different approach to decision making. So those are the things I think which will shift what happens eventually.
That's great, thanks, Alex. And Ian, you had a question relating to kind of influencing at the national level.
Hi, Alex. Thank you. Fantastic listening to you this morning. I think you've just kind of answered part of what I was asking, but I was really interested in the point you made about co-designed pathways of care and support, principally at a commissioning level. And are there any kind of opportunities or kind of positive examples of communities being involved in designing pathways of care and support? And it links to something Craig's just put up actually about if there are any positive kind of examples of that, what is the potential impact of integrated care systems, accountable care bodies? Is that going to kind of take away from a local focus, having more centralized control with larger areas of responsibility?
So a nice simple question there, Ian.
Sorry. Sorry.
Yeah, so I think, I mean, in terms of the ICSs, everybody sort of, talks about Harrogate and West Yorkshire and Rob Webster and team's ICS as being sort of one which I think has really majored on that community engagement side of things. And there are a few others, I think, as well. And I'm a little bit familiar with their work, and there's certainly some good stuff happening there. I think that is partly they're able to do that because there's a long history of investing and having a different kind of relationship, particularly in Leeds, which has built a strategy around its neighbourhood networks, where it has those council ward level community-led networks, and where they've devolved some resources down to those organisations. They're particularly around older people support. They're very older people led. And they've engaged their elected members, their councillors, in that kind of co-production. And I think that's something we often overlook, is if you've got these community initiatives, but the councillors aren't really up for it, or think that they are the community, or the community, they're the elected community representatives, but don't really get kind of co-production and equalities and so on, then that can really stymie things. I think the key challenge for the ICSs is scale again. So an ICS is huge. And a lot of what we've been talking about this morning has to happen at a neighbourhood level, not even a local authority level. So I think there are the germs of a sort of a scaled model there, with the primary care networks operating at a smaller scale. but the ability to have the coordination and the kind of goal setting of the ICS, and the ability to do some of those big medical things that need to happen in a big building once in a region, plus that's kind of asset-based community development happening almost at kind of the level of a GP surgery's catchment area. I've not seen an area that's an ICS that's really kind of can articulate that yet, and it may just be I haven't seen it, but that would for me I think would be the kind of the end goal. Plus that, let's set a different goal here around some, you know, a basket of health and well-being outcomes, not just inequalities outcomes, not just medical outcomes.
Yeah, a lot of what you're saying, Alex, relates back to the fact that it's about power and control, isn't it? So have you any ideas about how to get the power away from people who currently seem to want to control it?
Yeah, I think the two things worth talking about in public service reform are power and love, and they're the two things that would probably feel least comfortable talking about. It's one of the things that's valuable, I think, about shared lives and home share and family by families. If you talk to the people, they'll talk about love. You know, talk to a shared lives household, they say, oh, it's just part of the family and we love him or her. And that can be quite shocking. It's certainly shocking to me when I sort of, you know, started my career as a care assistant in a residential care home, you know, being taught about boundaries and professionalism and keeping your personal and professional lives separate and not having favorites and that sort of thing. Power, I think sort of, we need to have that conversation about both of those things. And, you know, I do still have faith that self-direct support, direct payments, that, you know, that are the right thing to do. And I think they've remained contested all the way through. But and there is a kind of a story on the left, I think, about personal budgets being a kind of Thatcherite consumerist initiative to try and turn us all into consumers. And there may well be people who thought that was, you know, kind of in the kind of more right-wing version, bits of the Blair government that thought that was what they were for. But I think they were born out of the disability rights movement, and as a way of people saying, you know, I want to control this service which is involved in all the intimate parts of my life. And I still think that's the right thing to do. And some of what we've seen over the sort of 20 odd years since then is, since that started, is the incredible ability of bureaucracies to assimilate disruptive influences into their worldview and to carry on doing what they wanted to do with a bit of rebranding and a few tweaks here and there. And, you know, I think we can't underestimate that tendency, and that I think is why we need that combination of the individual control plus the group, and the ability for people to be treated entirely as individuals, and then to be able to also find like-minded people. Because if you're an individual, even when you're an individual with significant money of your own in the public service sector, if you look in the care home, care homes for older people, some families can end up spending a really large amount of money on their care, and they can get really crap care, and find that they're completely powerless as consumers. And, you know, even though they're actually spending tens of thousands of pounds. So, you know, that really points to the limits of money as on its own as a source of power in public service sectors. But it's got to be part of it, I think. And then that idea of co-commissioning being embedded as an expectation is the next stage of that, I think.
Yeah, and for us, it's always about involving people early enough, not doing the patronising. We're going to consult with you at the end and still do what we were intending to do. So the kind of stuff we're talking about in some ways is radical innovation, isn't it? It's kind of an old school Nestor expression in some ways. And do you think that innovation it's not coming from having lots of money, is it? It's coming from really understanding the individuals and getting close to them, and people have their own solutions. They just need support to enable them.
Yes, and coming back to that sort of paradox of scale, it's that combination of that, plus being able to help people do that in a way which adds up to more than lots of individuals doing things differently, and adds up to a different kind of community or place. The TLAP and ourselves and Surgical Institute for Excellence developed something called the Social Co-Innovation Network, which brought together 16 councils and similar number of innovative organisations to look at how you might try and scale innovation in particular. And some of the conclusions from that were that innovation is often seen as new ideas, and that's really not the difficult thing. You know, we are blessed with hundreds of people and organizations coming up with brilliant new ideas all the time. That will always happen and always has. The problem is any of those ideas gaining traction, embedding and scaling. And the other conclusion we came to was that if you cannot scale an innovation or scale innovative and disruptive approaches just by doing things to them. So when I started this job, we were a really small or tiny organization. Shared Lives was not very well known at all, and for the first few years I was just very focused on all of the things we were doing for our members, the organizations and the people around all of the things you're supposed to do. You know, you need an infrastructure, you need kind of a quality assurance program, you need an outcome measuring approach, you need communities of practice, you need all of that stuff that commissioners will say, have you got all of that, before we were willing to take you seriously. And we did all of that, and we could demonstrate that the model was better and cheaper and all of the sorts of things that you're supposed to demonstrate, but it wasn't adding up to scale in lots of areas. And so we realized that actually we needed to think just as much about the commissioners and the people with power in that area as we did about the providers. And so we started working with councils and the NHS around that. And then I think more recently than that, I put that third part of the change alongside the provision and the commissioning as being that culture power shift, that idea that none of this happens unless there's a genuine commitment from right the way through a local area to this much more human and community-based, asset-based way of doing things. And if you don't have that, even with commissioner support, you're never going to scale up the sorts of things that we all think should be scaled up.
Yeah, no, interesting. So in terms of your own leadership journey then, it sounds like at times what you've had to do is conform a bit to what the commissioners are saying, and you have had to start using their language and the ways in which they like things done to help them to understand what you're trying to do. Would that be fair? Yeah,
I think that would be fair. I think by temperament, I'm a kind of certainly a compromiser, and so I sort of often talk about pragmatic radicalism, and what I mean by that is that the end point should look very, very different, but we've got to have a really stepped and kind of pragmatic way of approaching it. And I think that in our sector there are people that we've got plenty of people in the charity sector who are not very radical at all and extremely small c conservative and are quite, sort of can't really see things being different. And I was in a conversation with doing some work on the Meeting as Equals paper with a large charity, and somebody in a kind of senior position there talking about how scared they thought they were, or they thought their board would be by some of what we were talking about. And then we've also got people who are incredibly radical, but who also tend to be very allergic to working with or even sometimes talking with the people who are currently in power. And I think that certainly where I'd see things like Think Local Act Personal is it's attempting to be a bridge between those two worlds, because we can either have a block of people who kind of like this stuff, they're not bad people, who but don't really take it, can't really see how they could do much with it, and don't really like being shouted at. And you can have a group of people who are just very angry that things aren't different, but who aren't necessarily showing, kind of demonstrating what different would look like, certainly not at scale. Or we could try and bring that kind of energy and that infrastructure together in a way that gradually leads to something different. And I don't, will that work? I don't know, to be honest. But as I say, I think some of this is as much temperament as anything else, and it kind of.
That sounds a much better way to do it. I once had a director of children's services say, "Why are disabled children born to such angry parents?" which I thought was quite an interesting expression. Jude, you had a question.
Sorry, I'm just taking that in, Neil, because
Yeah.
I have SEN kids, and I am the angry parent at school. Do you know what I mean? It's and I just wondered about this kind of the other stuff. You started to talk about it, kind of the beneficiaries and staff, because they need a culture change as well. And I'm wondering, just a bit of kind of insight in what that looks like and where those challenges are, especially I think for your leadership.
Yeah, so certainly a massive change for us. It's a fairly small initiative, but it felt and has continued to feel massive for us, is employing people with lived experience as part of the team. And that mindset shift from people as beneficiaries or sort of end users or whatever to people as colleagues, which, I'm sure sort of, kind of from Neil's work and other organizations that are further along that road than we are, is kind of, you can recognize that's just a very different kind of organization, and you have different discussions. Our ambassadors team did some training for the rest of the team about disability inclusion and awareness the other week, and really what they actually ended up doing was they led a training session about all of our inclusion and communication and kindness and sort of looking after each other, which was a really powerful session for the team. Because we all need those sort of things. So in the Meeting as Equals paper I mentioned, I looked at what would it look like if you try to embed asset-based thinking through every aspect of a charity's work, because often we just think about it a little bit in terms of some governance stuff, maybe having somebody with lived experience on the board. We might look at it in terms of campaigns and people with lived experience being involved there. We don't tend to look at it in terms of things like fundraising, the core operations. There are lots of learning disability organisations whose core role is to support people with learning disabilities into employment who don't employ many people with learning disabilities themselves. So I think that we all need to look at our teams, and if we have a different group of people who are the beneficiaries of our organizations to the people who are employed in paid roles of our organizations, that's a problem. And actually, arguably, it's us being part of the problem as organizations. And I think the organizations that really impressed me have been ones where they've been much more radically user-led. And there's a couple of examples in that paper. Dot Smith, who runs Recovery Connections up in the Northeast, really inspirational organization. It's one of the few in substance misuse and residential substance misuse recovery that's outstanding, CQC outstanding. She describes her team and her work as messy because her team of people, nearly all of whom I think have lived experience of substance misuse. She describes a journey where that was always supposed to be the case, but when she arrived at that organization, there was a really toxic divide between the people with and the people without lived experience. And moving to a place where actually she was really able to sort of work with and understand the benefit of people's lived experience by not expecting people to fit into a traditional organizational structure and bureaucracy. She talks about working in a much more trauma-informed way, for instance. Really changing everything about how that organization thinks and works, with fantastic results, but with huge sort of challenges and probably lots of risks along the way.
Fantastic. That's really interesting, Alex. Okay, I'm conscious of the time coming up for us. If people have a question, any last minute questions, kind of put them in the chat and we'll get to them. We'll put your hand up and wave at me. In the meantime, Alex, can give us 3 things that which would be your advice for someone going through the changes at the moment in terms of leadership to sort of radically change and challenge some of our commissioning friends and challenge the world a bit. What are the 3 things that you would say have given you the strength to do this?
So I think the who's in the room is kind of a key question. We'll never do things differently if the same group of people are in the room making the decision. So I think having a more diverse group of people in the room and insisting on that as part of our role in our conversations with commissioners. So when I'm asked to speak at conferences, usually I'm doing that as a double act with one of the people with lived experience, and that just has a very different kind of impact. So it's as much about sort of who's in the room, and I think it's as much, and this was the key message of Meeting as Equals paper, is it's how we do things as much as what we do. and the who is doing the we are is a key part of the how. But so are we? How much compromising and how many shortcuts are we having to take in order to maintain current commissioning relationships? There is a cost to that. I'm not saying we can always avoid it, but there's a definite cost to that. And I was struck by some of the organizations I was talking to who were willing to scale down, were willing to walk away from toxic commissioner relationships. And in order to rebuild an organization initially on a smaller scale based on doing what they wanted to do in the way they wanted to do it. I think Mayday Trust in the homelessness sector is a really great example of that, for instance. So that courage to scale down, I think, would be, we've had an era where, which we're still in to some extent, where growth was kind of equated to impact, scale was equated to impact. And as a result, we've got some really big organizations which, in my view, aren't having any impact, because you could switch them out for some other similar organizations, or even for some private sector organizations, and the people receiving the support might not notice that much difference. So to me, that's not impact. So what do we really think about impact, and who is the we that's deciding what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. That's really, really useful. Okay, so Alex, it's been really good to speak to you. Craig, did you have one last question that you wanted? I wasn't sure, because I saw something in the chat just now.
No, I haven't. I was just offering a bit of commentaries that came into my mind. It's been a really great session today. I've really enjoyed it. I think we all have. It's touched, I think, on a lot of our work. I think there's loads of challenges as well for us, particularly in that last passage, Alex, about, well, what are we doing in our organisations, particularly around employment and being in the room with people. Alex is a trustee of Voiceability, which is my old organisation, as it were, and I know that organisation's always done that really, really well. But it's hard, and to quote the person in the northeast, it's messy, and people don't always get it. but it does change dynamics, and I think finally from me, I think a big takeaway from myself from Alex's points today is that there will be the structure, the cycle of structural change at a large scale will always be with us. It'll do whatever it does, and that may not change. It may never change in a revolutionary way. Therefore, it's incumbent on us, I think, to work at levels where we can affect change, and to promote and celebrate and spread that kind of a change. But that's not necessarily about scaling stuff up. It's also about what I call scaling out, which is giving people the tools and the opportunities and the IP and support that they need to make things happen, but not necessarily growing organisations. And I think Shared Lives Plus is a very good exemplar of that kind of an approach. So I think there's been loads here to think about for all of us in running organisations with and for people with disabilities. So it's been brilliant. So thanks so much, Alex, for your time and your thoughtfulness today, and energy as well. It's been great. I think we've all got to jump in separate directions. Also, just thanks very much to Neil for presenting, for leading the conversation, and to Penn for organising. So we've got Steve Gilbert next week on a very related topic of how we ensure that people with lived experience are present in our organisations, in our boardrooms, in our teams, and in the conversations that affect the shaping of services. Steve's a charismatic, interesting, very thoughtful man, and I'd be delighted if you're able to join that session next week, which I think Chris Monday is leading on. Chris, is that right? You're leading the interview next week as well, which I think is. So it's fantastic. Steve's a current user of mental health services as well. He's very upfront about that. So he brings real kind of current experience into the conversation. So that's Steve Gilbert next week. We'll be sending out more info on that soon.